Okay, welcome everyone. So I am so sorry for anyone who wanted to have like a live session with me to go over any sort of DM level advice. I do apologize. Our term four schedule is a little intensive, so I didn't have time to kind of put together a good time slot for when I could meet with you guys. So I went ahead and decided to do a quick recording of everything that I thought was important that will help you guys in terms of prepping for DM and what you need to know specifically and things I would do differently if I had to go through term two DM module again. So as always, DM is a very big module. I just want to give a quick intro and say that it often feels like when I think back to DM, it often feels like it's MSK, a little bit of CPR, and a little bit of hormones and everything thrown into a blender, and then they said go for it. So it's 4 weeks long. It's one of the longer modules you'll take, just like MSK, and you have to be aware of that. And that's a very big factor because when you're going through DM, there are often times when you feel like you've forgotten a lot of things and it just feels overwhelming. But I want to reassure everyone who's watching the recording that it's going to be okay and you're going to get through this material just fine. Let me get my thing set up and let's start. So as always, a group of us run Here's the TPLG. It's a great Facebook group and feel free to join it. And we have weekend review sessions as well as helpful document support, as well as we're happy to address any sort of questions that you guys might have for each module and Anki, anything under the sun that you can think of. In way you can join it is you can scan this QR code and it'll directly go to our Facebook page. There you can get access to our drive, which has already material uploaded for DM. And then I'll also pinpoint at the end of this kind of presentation, all of the slides and external resources and things that you can potentially utilize on your way through term two and DM specifically. Okay, so DM. Everyone keeps saying DM. No, we're not sliding into anyone's DM. DM stands for digestion and metabolism, and it's a broad overview of what you need to know for the next, I guess, 4 weeks and what you eventually need to know for BSCE and eventually way off in the future, step one. What you need to know is that it's composed of multiple disciplines. Before, you guys took MSK and it was just one thing and maybe a little bit of physiology thrown in, a little anatomy, and it's not too bad. DM is kind of like MSK on steroids, in my opinion. It's a combination of everything that they could think of, put into a blender, and voila, they made DM. The reason why DM is so intensive is because it covers so many disciplines and it's a challenging module for that reason alone. Lectures can often feel like you're getting a whiplash from going from, you're covering anatomy one like fine lecture, and the next thing you know, you're covering biochemistry, an entire pathway, and you have to, pardon my pun, digest it and fully make sense of what is being essentially passed on to you by the professors and the faculty at SGU. So the disciplines that are going to be covered is biochemistry. And the critical thing I want to emphasize here is feeding versus fasting state. Everyone spends time learning the entire pathway, which I believe you should, because it's a great way to reinforce the material and set yourself up correctly for when you actually need to know the critical information, which is, of course, going to be the rate limiting steps. The rate limiting steps here, and I want to say a caveat is you also need to know clinical correlates. The clinical correlates in this module are going to be much more heavily dependent on those rate limiting steps, especially for the biochemistry section. I can give you guys a quick example, right? Let's say, a patient comes in and let's say they've taken some arsenic, right? Arsenic poisoning. What enzymes can be shut down? Like what pathways can be inhibited? And that's going to be very critical because if you know that and you know what drug to administer to counteract it, you've essentially know the entire pathway from a clinical correlate perspective all the way down to the molecular enzymatic level. Okay. So that's why it's important that you guys learn the entire pathway once. I'm saying that with emphasis, learn it once, and then you can just go back when you're doing the reviews to essentially cover the rate limiting steps, the clinical correlates attached to them, and eventually do well on the exam. Anatomy and embryology, this one is very, very important. A lot of people slept on anatomy because honestly, the GIT, the gastrointestinal system, is just one giant tube at the end of the day. And everyone's like, oh, yeah, like, this goes here and this goes there. But as always, take the form, right? Whenever there's a form related component in anatomy, it's always going to dictate function, right? And the same thing applies for embryology. When there's something structurally wrong, it's going to affect things that will have downstream effects on the patient or the pediatrics patient or the child that's born. For example, you should be able to distinguish how an omphalocele presents versus, like, I don't know, an umbilical hernia, right? And remember, for embryology, it often tends to be very buzzwordy. So make sure you guys are underlining and highlighting the things that are critical for embryology. Anatomy, don't sleep on anatomy, especially the structural changes that happen during the embryological development that could potentially go wrong, because they love to ask those questions. And a lot of people just knew the general anatomy, like they know how to tell you what's the difference between a stomach and an ileum and a jejunum and so on and so forth. But what they couldn't tell is often the structural changes that can happen, whether if you have a malrotation, whether you have like an annular pancreas when the pancreas is kind of butted off and started squeezing, causing a stenosis of the actual digestive system. So a lot of these things make it into a clinical narrative and it'll make a lot more sense. Physiology wise, this is critical because physiology dictates a lot of the things that you will see. How, when food enters your system, all the way to when it gets converted into the actual energy components that you can utilize. Remember those, random receptors you learned in FTM? You're like, why do I need to know GLUT1? Why do I need to know GLUT2, 3, and 4? It's now all going to come back in a full picture. So make sure you guys learn it well the first time around so that it makes intuitive sense going through. And don't sleep on physiology because it was a big component of our own exam. And it's a lot of thing. It's something that a lot of people weren't too sure that it was going to be a big part because a lot of it is intuitive. You can essentially say like, oh yeah, if I'm stressed out, obviously my food isn't going to digest properly. But know the underlying mechanism. Is it the elevated levels of histamine? Is it epinephrine, norepinephrine? Is it elevated gastric secretions, increased motility? All of those components make it into a cohesive picture. And I swear to you, you're going to kill the physiology section. The histology component is a little challenging. Of course, it's nothing compared to renal physiology where you have to distinguish a duct versus when you're seeing a glomeruli. But histology here is going to be a little bit more challenging because each level of the GIT has its own unique histology. So when you're going through it, make I guess, an anatomical picture as to where you are, what is the critical component of it, and how you can distinguish it versus something else that they might give you. Because a lot of people spend time learning about, oh yeah, like I know what a liver looks like in the gross specimen, but it's often hard to distinguish the subdividing units of the liver into its specific components. So draw a picture, put it into like a PowerPoint document, review it multiple times because histology is a big component and they can pull questions from histology and make it into a biochemical pathway / physiology component as well. As always, I'm going to emphasize this again and again. Clinical correlates, whether it's an enzyme deficiency, a disorder, or an abnormality or a malformation, it has to be known, right? There's a reason why they do it this way. Because when you're learning through the things, especially for DM, it's so easy to just be caught up with an entire biochemical pathway that you might lose the big picture, right? What happens if I don't have this enzyme? What if I have a G6PD deficiency? Am I going to go into a hemolytic crisis? What type of presentation does that happen and appear with? So make sure you guys review that, and it's going to help you guys a lot in keeping the enzyme straight, and two, the associated disorders and how they are going to present, right? And don't sleep on the minor pathways, because a lot of people often forgot about the minor pathways or didn't review it as properly with their due diligence as they should. So make sure you review that. The next thing is my general approach for DM. Okay. It's a lot of biochemistry. I'm not going to lie to you. It's a good chunk of the exam, but make sure you guys pace yourself, right? The biochemistry isn't the only component. Make sure you guys review Ninja Nerd if you guys need help with physiology. There are plenty of grades questions, and then there's a whole compiled document of all the other resources, right? All the other practice questions that folks have found in the past and compiled it into a single document that is just freaking amazing, but it's a lot of questions. It's 700 plus questions. So do not freak out. You don't need to do all of them, but make sure you do as much as you can in that document, because it is a compilation of both the Sakai, the IMCQs, and all sorts of other kind of external resources, pre-test, BRS. It's all put into this document, and it's great. It is a challenging document because when you're going through the first pass and you're going through some practice questions, it can be difficult, but it is doable, okay? In terms of pathways, learn the pathways once. Whether you're a whiteboarder, whether you need to do Anki, learn it thoroughly from top to bottom, right? What happens from glycolysis when glucose enters your bloodstream, to all the way to when it gets broken down and stored or used up metabolically. Learn that entire pathway once and then stop. Okay, do not go back and review it over and over again. What I will tell you to review is the rate limiting steps for each of the pathways, as well as the components that you need to know for fed versus fasting state. Okay, critical, important, got to know it very well. Next thing, review the clinical correlates during your second and third pass. I'm emphasizing that again because the pathways, you're going to learn it well once. You're going to remember glycolysis fantastically week 1, maybe week 2, but week 3 and week 4 are going to be a little bit more challenging. So that's why I want to ease your guys' mind by saying rate limiting steps, the factors that will either increase the enzymatic activity or decrease it, right? What if we have excess of NADH, or we have a deficiency of it? Which enzymes are going to be upregulated, which enzymes are going to be downregulated is going to be critical. Next thing, use your supplemental resources wisely. Remember, this is an SGU exam, so they're going to ask you SGU material. First aid, BNB, Ninja Nerd are all great. As always, make sure you use them as a summary, as a summative tool, rather than your pure source of learning, because they are prepping you for boards and giving you content level knowledge that is appropriate to that level. But as always, they want you guys to be subject level experts here when you're going through the material. Next, do not sleep on practice questions. I know it can be very easy when you're doing the pathways and learning them once that I have to whiteboard the whole thing. I have to make sure I get every single, substrate, every single enzyme, every single factor that, dictates that enzyme to be put on paper or on a whiteboard or done in an Anki card. But do not sleep on practice questions, because then you're going to scramble at the last minute to do all those practice questions, whether it's the McDaddy, the Sakai, so on and so forth. Then before you guys go to your small groups, make sure you review those histo slides. Those exact histo slides are going to show up on the exam. I went through them. It's a lot, and I often found them challenging, but it is definitely doable if you notice that there are compiled documents of these histological slides already floating around. Okay. Next, DM should be learned very well, because BSCE prep is highly important. I'm not going to freak you guys out by saying you should do your BSCE prep now, but make sure you guys start learning your DM material very well, because it is a component of the BSCE, and some might even argue that it is a big component. So keep that in mind, and it will be okay for DM. Next thing, what would I do different? I would not panic. Okay. It's so easy. It's so easy to panic with large modules, because As a term 4 student, I'm currently going through a very large module and I feel like I'm losing information as I'm putting in information. So make sure you guys review your content in a stacked manner. A little bit more on this in the next slide, but do not panic. You will know the pathways and you will know them sufficiently before you show up to the exam, because it's going to be rate limiting steps. It's going to be factors that influence those enzymes and how they dictate the entire body's physiological response when you're fed versus fasting. Okay. Now, do not panic if you do not remember the entire pathway. And this is tied into point one. Okay. Every day I felt like I was relearning glycolysis for the 15th billionth time. Don't worry, you will get a hang of the material and it will make sense. The next thing is to do those practice questions for physiology. Physiology is one of those things where intuitively, when you're going through the lecture material, it's going to make sense. Okay. Nothing is impossible in those lectures. There are very little concepts that are truly impossible that's going to be presented to you, but it is something that is easy to ignore, and points are lost that way. Okay. Next, cover embryology and its clinical correlates very thoroughly and know the buzzwords for them, because when you're going through this, embryology is a big component. The whole gastrointestinal system comes from a single tube, and the way it rotates and squiggles around is how it essentially makes up your day-to-day functions, right? Whether it goes from your minor appendicitis surgery all the way till, let's say, you have Hirschsprung disease, you're gonna have to know what goes wrong in each of the potential organs that you're covering. Next, do not forget to review the minor pathways, right? You need to know what happens with phenylketonuria, right? Like what happens with elevated levels of any sort of substrate and how it can deposit in the body and present clinically as signs and symptoms. Because often folks were like, oh yeah, like I know what my lactate pathway is going to be along. And they often lost points that way because they were like, oh, lactate pathway is very easy. Like lactic acid just generates, but you have to remember it goes to the liver where it goes through the Cori cycle. From the Cori cycle, it gets turned into pyruvate. And that whole process is a minor pathway that folks often ignored. And it often showed up on the exam. Same thing with any of the other disorders and the pathways associated with them. Don't forget to review your ER pathway because there are disorders associated with them as well. That's getting to point 6. Review ER concepts, especially the ones that I've highlighted, the CYP deficiencies, the anatomy components, as well as the hormone interactions, right? What happens when you have high levels of TSH? If TSH is elevated, is prolactin elevated? How does that interact and how does that present? They love asking those questions again because it is a great cumulative review question to throw at you guys. Once again, do not sleep on practice questions, especially for anatomy and embryology for the ones that you are assigned in Sakai or your online portal system, because the grades questions I kind of put off till later because I was more, I guess, interested in doing those 700 practice questions that I was panicking about. And I didn't realize at that time, but now I do, that it's a really good thing that you guys go through anatomy and embryo first, because it is a big portion of what they like to test on as well. And it gives you some time to, pardon my pun again, digest the material better before, exam day. Okay. I mentioned this before, but stacking the material that you're learning. Okay. DM is a long module. I'm not going to lie to you guys. And weeks 1 through 4 will go by in an instant, but the material has to stay fresh, right? So I just gave you guys a hypothetical situation as to how you could potentially stack the information so that what you need to know stays with you for the next 4 weeks to the degree that you need to for the exam, okay? I gave you guys a hypothetical situation, which is here. Week 1, right? Like roughly weekend 1, review the major pathways, right? Especially the rate limiting enzymes, and do the entire pathway, right? Let's say they taught you glycolysis. Learn the entire pathway from when glucose enters a cell all the way to when it gets converted into pyruvate, right? Critical that you go through that entire motion. Week 2, right? More so weekend 2, cover the rate limiting steps, for example, for glycolysis, and then walk through the full pathway of, let's say, the Krebs cycle as well as the electron transport chain. Then augment it with embryology plus anatomy, practice questions, and reviews, right? Whether it's review sessions held by Scrubs and Dog Mom, they're fantastic. Make sure you guys attend those because they're great summative review sessions that shows you what you need to know, as well as review sessions that I will likely hold. Week 3, right? Stack your material again. Now review all of the major rate limiting enzymes for each of the pathways that you've covered thus far. And I say week 3 more like the weekend once again, and add the minor pathways into the mix because by this time you're going to be kind of exhausted of the amount of pathways you've learned. And then finally, make sure you guys do your physiology and histology questions. If my memory serves right, this was the general order in which the DM module was delivered to us, okay? This is the material that is important and the way you could potentially keep it fresh. As always, Anki, active learning, recall, whatever you can do to stay fresh with the material, do it because now you guys are term 2s, you guys know what works for you in terms of study habits and you can deliver on it. And then finally, some external resources. Remember, as always, I say lecture slides first and then everything else, okay? Because remember, this is not, none of these resources here are specifically SGU specific, okay? As to their exams and etc. If you need help with physiology and understanding what is going on with the gastrointestinal system, watch the entire Ninja Nerd series. He covers it from top to bottom. It's fantastic. For those who want like a quick short summary approach to biochemistry and the pathways, Dirty Med is fantastic. I put all the links to this and I'll upload the PowerPoint that has all these links and resources so that you guys can go directly to them and save them, bookmark them, etc. Okay. The notes and components that you guys need are already uploaded on the drive, so don't worry about those. What I use for anatomy a little bit, just to reinforce some of the material and kind of keep it fresh and deliver it a different way, is the Noted Anatomist. He's really great. His digestive system one is fantastic. The anterior abdominal wall, as well as the retroperitoneal space ones, videos are fantastic as a great summary. But as always, SGU wants to know SGU specific things with anatomy. So make sure you guys review those both in terms of vasculature as well as lymphatics and where everything drains to, right? Because they love to ask those generalized questions now, because when you guys are moving into other terms, that's when pathology comes into play and the way disorders present as well as diseases. Okay, Boards and Beyond, not free. You guys know that by now, but it's great because it provides you step level prep for the material. It's great high level information that you need to kind of summarize everything up for the weekend, but I wouldn't use it as my primary learning tool, okay? Osmosis, I had a blast using Osmosis, especially their pathway videos, fantastic. Their animations themselves are kind of fun. So it kept it fresh in my mind. And finally, I've linked it out in this PowerPoint itself, the McDaddy 700 question series. Feel free to download it and start doing questions right away. Whether it's challenging now, don't worry about it. There are 700 questions. By the time you're through this entire module, you would have done a good chunk of the McDaddy, if not all of the questions. I'm going to tell you guys my number of how far I got. I think I got close to like 550 or close to like 600 questions done by the time I showed up for this exam. Not saying you have to do all of them, but you will do a good chunk of them because they are very good and they have multiple resources and actually sources that they pull from. So as always, best of luck to you guys in DM. The prep for this module is intense, especially for the exam, but trust me, make sure you guys follow through on the steps that I provided, as well as like use those resources that I'm shared here. Well, feel free to message me. And you guys know the Facebook group that I'm part of. Here's the TPLG. Feel free to follow us and wish you guys best of luck on